It's time to make a return to the world of Windows gaming, but not in the way that you might expect, since we're specifically making a return to the topic of Winlator and all that it offers. For those unaware, Winlator, simply put, allows us to run our PC games on our Android devices, and for the first time ever, we will focus in on the Odin 2 family of devices, including the new Odin 2 Portal, which are all powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. And best of all, this should be helpful to those that have similar spec hardware. The possibilities that open thanks to Winlator are endless, and I hope that this video will inspire you to tinker and try out Winlator for yourself. So please join me, Rob Lee Retro Tech Dad, as we yet again dive into the world of Winlator and get all set up with our Odin 2 hardware, discover some new games, and hopefully by the end of it all, you'll be ripping and tearing with the best of them. The goal of this video is not to only show you what's possible with Winlator, but to try and help everyone get things up and running in the simplest way possible, and really so that others can get in on the magic of Winlator and the world that it opens up on Android, and specifically for this video, the Odin 2 family of devices, including the Odin 2 Portal. I'll be focusing in on games that are both readily available on GOG.com because they are DRM free and easy to get up and running with Winlator, as well as some games that have been long delisted and can be found online as abandonware at your discretion. I've also focused on games that have controller support right out of the box to minimize the amount of complexity when it comes to getting set up with Winlator. If you're already familiar with Winlator's setup, or if you're just wanting to see the game's showcase first, feel free to skip ahead. As always, I have everything timestamped for your convenience. So let's go ahead and dive right into this and open up Chrome and head on over to the Winlator Frost GitHub page, which is the fork of Winlator that we'll be using for this video specifically. I will have all of this linked directly in my description area to make things as easy as possible, and all this can be done right on your device directly. For this video, we will be using Winlator Frost and specifically the 7.1.3 GLIBC version 3, which I've done extensive testing with in the past few weeks. I will say that I've tried both Winlator 9 as well as Winlator Frost 9, but in my experience, the 7.1.3 version has great compatibility with our Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 devices, and overall for the games that I'm showcasing here, I have found version 7.1.3 to work best. So again, I will have the GitHub page as well as a direct download link to this version, but go ahead and install the APK file, and you might get a prompt from Chrome to install unknown apps. Just go into settings, and then toggle on allow from source, and the install screen should appear, so just go ahead and install and then open up Winlator for the first time. Make sure to give access to Winlator by selecting Allow, and Winlator will then proceed to do its thing by installing the necessary system files. You will get another prompt to give all files access to Winlator, so tap on OK and then toggle on Allow Access to manage all files and then hit back. Okay, so we are now on the main screen of Winlator, and there's not a whole lot going on here just yet, but let's start out by creating our first container, which is the desktop environment for Winlator and will allow us to install games as well as other files as needed. This is pretty simple to do, just tap on the plus sign in the top right corner and then we will get the new container screen. Now don't be intimidated here, we will go through this quickly, but for the most part we will be leaving things at default. We can't make a change to the turnip driver version here, but we will be able to after we've created this container. So let's just get through this so that we can get to our Winlator desktop. The first change I like to make here is show FPS, which is great for tracking performance. Now if we scroll all the way down, we can go ahead and change the GPU name to something a bit more modern. It's not critical, but while we are here, we might as well go for it. I'll set this to something like the GTX 1080. And then way at the bottom, let's change the video memory size to 4096 megabytes, and everything else we can leave alone here, and then let's just check out the other tabs. For Win components, we will leave everything at default, and the same goes for environment variables. So now in the drive section, we will leave things alone here, but we will return in just a moment to this specific section so that we can add our external storage like a micro SD card, but for right now, just leave this alone. Let's head on over to the Advanced tab, and here I like using the Performance Box 64 preset, which you can select by tapping on the drop-down menu. We will leave the startup selection as aggressive, and then leave the Enable X input, which will allow us to use our built-in controls on the Odin 2, and every game in this showcase has built-in controller support, so it should work right out of the box. And finally, for the processor affinity, I like to disable the CPU 0, 1, 2, and 3 cores for both sections. Once you've done all that, we are ready to finalize, and then you can tap on the check mark in the bottom right corner to finish. And Winlator will return you to the main screen, and now you can see that we do have a container available to start up. Now before we do that, let's go ahead and finalize our default settings for this container. If you tap on the 3 dots to the right of the container, we have the option to edit our settings, and when selected, you will get the edit container window to appear. Now this looks identical to what we just came from, but we can now edit the graphics driver version for Turnip, and we will be leaving this at 25.0.0.4. And throughout the video, I will let you know if you need to change anything here, as well as any other portion, which can be done on a per game basis, and we will cover that as well in just a moment. Okay, so while we are here, let's talk about using our micro SD cards as external storage for Winlator, which does require a few specific steps. So head on over to the Drives tab again, which is where we will be able to map our micro SD card. Now here you'll see that we have our standard out-of-the-box drives configured for Winlator. The D drive is automatically set to map to your internal storage and points to the Downloads folder. Now Winlator does have a C drive that I do recommend installing some games to, since it will be faster than running off the external micro SD card. But for most games this isn't an issue, and of course I will let you know which games I recommend installing to that C drive. So to add our micro SD storage, we do need to take one additional step, and so we need to head on over to the Google Play Store and download a file manager app such as EX File Manager or any one that you might prefer. We only really need to do this for this one quick step, which is to get the ID of our micro SD card so that we can add it to Winlator, since you can't just navigate to the micro SD storage. If you go the EX File Manager route, just be aware it is a free app that has some ads, but again we only need it this one time for setup, so not too much of a deal breaker here. Once you've downloaded and installed the app, you will want to go into the disk option, which refers to your micro SD storage. And your screen should look similar to this, and if you notice in the top left, right below the burger, we have storage and then a string of numbers. This is your identifier for your micro SD storage, and it is a unique number and will be different for your card. In my case, the 8 characters are 6538-3133, so we want to make a note of this because we will need it for Winlator, which we will go ahead and jump right back into that app. So now that we are equipped with this newfound information, let's go ahead and click Add to add the new drive to Winlator, and you should get a new window that appears to enter some text. We will start out by typing /, then the word storage, and then add another /, and then enter the 8-character ID that we obtained from the file manager. You will want to make sure that you enter it with the hyphen in between the set of 4 characters. So for example, here I will enter 6538-3133, which again is going to be different on your end and is unique to the micro SD card. And then you can add another /, and you can choose to leave this alone now, which means that this drive will point to the root of your micro SD card. And for me, that's how I want to set it up. But let's say you have a folder that you want Winlator to open up directly. You would put that folder name after the /. So let's tap on the check mark, and now we return to our drive list, and you can change the drive letter that's been assigned to your micro SD card, but I will leave it alone with the drive letter F. Tap on the check mark here to save your changes. We're now back on the Winlator home screen. Let's quickly go over some of the additional settings and options that we can tweak here with Winlator by tapping on the burger icon in the top left corner. This will bring up a side menu with various options, including one of the most important ones for launching games, which is the shortcuts section. And right now it doesn't actually have anything populated since we haven't actually installed any games together just yet. Below the container option, we have input controls, and for the purpose of this video, we will actually not cover anything in this section since every game in this video supports the built-in controls, and as such, there's no need to do any kind of mapping, which takes away a lot of the complexity. But thankfully, this is typically more of an issue with much older PC games. We're going to now skip through and then land on the settings option, and here we can adjust the Box 64 version as well as the preset that is being used here. For this video, I recommend just sticking with 0.3.1.8G2, since we are using an 8 Gen 2 device, and then for the preset, set it to performance. This is what I consider our default settings, and throughout the video I will let you know if any game needs changes from this in their shortcut. Additionally, we will talk about creating custom presets, which only 2 or 3 games require, and I do have that timestamped if you're curious about it, but it will come up during the video as a more natural progression of what we're doing here. So we finally reached that moment when we should probably go ahead and start up our container for the first time and get into the Winlator desktop environment, which is critical for installing and mapping our games as well as some other key things. So, welcome to your Winlator desktop, and this should look somewhat like a Windows environment, and if you notice, we have the File Explorer that opens up automatically. Now, before we get into installing games and whatnot, there are a few things I like to do just as a general thing before we dive into all of that. Winlator does need some dependencies installed, and this can be done pretty easily right from the Start menu, and then going to System Tools, and then let's first start with the Wine Gecko installer, and once that's been installed, head on back to the Start menu, and then System Tools, and launch the Wine Mono installer and let that do its thing. So now we're ready to talk about installing games, and this is a pretty straightforward process. So you can either copy over your game files to your device or micro SD card, or you can install them directly here in the container. Now, if you recall, the D drive here is mapped to our device's downloads folder, and from here, you can easily access any files you've added to your downloads folder on the internal storage. Now, to access the micro SD storage that we added, all we need to do is go to the F drive that we added earlier, and as you can see here, the contents of my micro SD card are all present here. I already have a bunch of GOG games that I've installed already to my micro SD card, and so let's cover this process first since it's pretty simple. On my micro SD card, I have the standard GOG games folder created from when I installed my GOG games, and of course inside here I have all the games that I've already installed to this micro SD card. This is pretty awesome because I can actually move my micro SD card from device to device, but most importantly, you can choose to install the GOG game on your PC and then just copy over the game files to a micro SD card. If I go into the Tomb Raider folder, for example, you will see all of the game contents here, but it's very cumbersome to go through these steps just to get to the game exe, which is tombRaider.exe. So what we can do here is create a shortcut which places it on the desktop here, but most importantly creates a shortcut in Winlator that we can launch quickly from. So all we have to do is tap with 2 fingers, which will bring up the right-click prompt, and from here we can select Create Shortcut, and now we have a direct shortcut to Tomb Raider, as you can see here on the container desktop. Okay, so let's now go through the process of installing a GOG game to this container. I'll navigate to the folder that contains the installer for the game I want to install, which in this case will be Crash Time Undercover, since it's a small game and will be a quick installation. Now from here you can either choose to install it to this default C directory, which again will offer the fastest speeds, but since storage is always a concern, we can point the installer to the F directory and install games right to the micro SD card by clicking on Options and then changing the drive letter, or by clicking on Browse and then pointing to the directory that you want to install the game to. Once you've done that, just click Install and then let the installer do its thing. Now for much larger games, this will definitely take a lot longer, which is why you can always opt to install the game on your PC and then copy the game files over and create a shortcut like we just did prior to this. The installer will automatically place a shortcut on the desktop when done, which means we also have a shortcut available to us in Winlator, so no need to map any shortcuts. Now, one final thing here to be mindful of are any game dependencies that might need to be installed, such as Visual C++ or DirectX dependencies that might be needed. Now, usually games will install this on its own, but if you're just copying game files over, I definitely recommend double checking the game folders and looking for something like a redist folder, and usually those will contain installers for things like C++ runtime libraries. For example, here I have Sleeping Dogs, and it does in fact have a redistributable folder, and so just go through these one by one to make sure you have everything needed just like you would on an actual PC. Okay, let's now exit out of this container and check out the 2 new shortcuts that we should have here in the main menu of Winlator. We can get to the shortcuts by tapping on the burger in the top left, and then selecting shortcuts, and as you can see here, we have shortcuts for both Crash Time Undercover and Tomb Raider. Now, shortcuts serve another important purpose, and that is to allow us to make changes on a per game basis. We can do this by tapping on the 3 dots all the way to the right of the specific game you want to edit, and then a small window will appear, and from here tap on Settings, which will then open up a window, and this should look familiar to the settings we saw from earlier on, which will allow us to tweak things like the graphics driver and DX wrapper, as well as advanced settings and whatnot. Throughout this video, I will let you know if we need to make any specific changes, and if you do, this is how you would do it on a per game basis. Finally, we can go one step beyond the shortcuts here and place a direct shortcut right on your Android home screen to quickly launch a game once you've got everything all nice and set up. You can do this by selecting the 3 dots again all the way to the right, and then choose Add to Home Screen, and just like that, we have an icon for this game on the home screen. And just some last tips before we head into the games showcase. The goal of this video is to get you up and running, and while the selection of games that follow are an awesome way to get going with Winlator, the idea is to inspire your own exploration and try out games beyond just what has been featured here. As part of that tinkering process, you might come across games that are more problematic than others, but there's lots of options that can be adjusted to test with, and so don't be afraid to experiment with your game shortcuts. Typically, I recommend trying out different versions of the turnip drivers as well as the DXVK wrappers, and for even more problematic games, possibly switching over to different wrappers like YND3D or VKD3D, as well as going into the advanced options and changing the Box 64 versions and their presets. The compatibility and stability options are good for troubleshooting games that may crash frequently or just refuse to launch. But as always, don't be shy and ask down below in the comments section or over on Discord, as I'm always happy to help, but we have a wonderful community out there willing to help as well. So we're now ready for our games showcase, and every game here was tested using the Odin 2's high performance option with the Smart Band preset. We're gonna start this showcase off with a bang, and up first is none other than Bioshock Infinite. And this is one exceptional game that, for me to this day, is still one of the most memorable experiences I've had in gaming. Now, Infinite is not a new game by any means, with it originally releasing back in 2013, but it really remains one of those AAA games that has held up and is well worth playing through. Infinite did receive ports to multiple platforms, including the Nintendo Switch, so for our Odin 2 users, we do have more than one way to enjoy this game. Personally, I've had much better success with the PC GOG version, and I'd say that performance is much better here with Winlator. I've got the game set to use a resolution of 1280 by 720 using low settings, which means we do have some room here to adjust. Now for this game specifically, I highly recommend installing it to the Winlator C drive, since this game does stream its assets in, and so as such we really do need that internal speed, which will help tremendously with load times, but also with in-game performance, which as you can see here, when I switch over to the game installed on my micro SD card, we get very bad dips in frame rate as well as issues with textures not loading in properly. This game just uses our default Winlator container settings, and just give it a moment on the initial load up since it does take longer than most games. Blur makes a return to the channel, and I actually just recently featured this game in my Odin 2 Portal preview video, but Blur very much deserves a spot here as a game that at its time of release was very much overlooked, and it's a shame because Blur is an awesome and fun racing game experience, which comes to us from Bizarre Creations, the same studio that was responsible for the Project Gotham Racing series, and unfortunately is now defunct, and so both a sequel to Blur and any future projects from the studio will never happen. Thankfully, we do have this very excellent game to enjoy that does pretty well here with Winlator. Blur is a game that is no longer available for purchase anywhere on PC, so it is essentially abandonware, and as such, with a quick search, you should be able to find this game pretty easily on the internet. This is just the first of a few more of these delisted abandonware type games that I will be showing off in this video. For Blur, the only change I recommend making to its shortcut is switching the audio over to the pulse audio option, which will help with any sound issues. Other than that, the default container settings apply here, and it's a very compatible game as I've tested this on lower end hardware like the Retro Pocket 5 with pretty solid success as well. The game is surprisingly still pretty demanding, and I have the resolution set here to 960 by 544, using the lowest settings to keep the frame rate as high as possible, which does fluctuate but stays in the upper end in the 50s. And we not only have another racing game to follow up, but another game that is no longer available for purchase and has been delisted. Dirt Showdown is one of many games part of the Dirt Racing franchise, with many other entries delisted from storefronts as well. Now while Showdown might not be the best entry in the series, it is one of my personal favorites. Dirt Showdown is another one of these Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 era games that I really enjoy revisiting with Winlator, and as I've said before, is an awesome use case for something like Winlator. Surprisingly, Showdown gave me a little bit of trouble initially to launch, so we do need a set of specific settings for this game. Now I mentioned earlier in the video that we will need to occasionally make a duplicate of a profile, so let's go ahead and do that here as an example of how we can create specific Box 64 presets for a game. It's pretty straightforward. By pressing the hamburger in the top left corner, the Winlator menu will come up, and from here we will want to head on over into the settings option, and a new screen will appear with your Box 64 version and Box 64 preset. So in the Box 64 preset, I like to start with the performance option, and then to the right we have a few icons. Now one of those icons allows us to make a duplicate of the preset, which is the second icon from the right. You will get a pop-up that asks if you want to duplicate this preset, which is how you'll know that you've selected the correct icon. So hit OK, and now we have the performance preset with a 1 added to the end of its name. So let's give this a better name, which we can do by selecting the edit option, which is the second icon from the left. And again, we will get a new window that pops up and allows us to edit the preset. I'll go ahead and name this Dirt Showdown so that we know that these specific tweaks are for this game when it comes time to configuring our options. And since we have this opened already, we might as well go through and make those changes that we need for Dirt Showdown specifically. For the Box 64 Safe Flags option, set it to 2, and then scroll down just a little bit until you get to the Box 64 Wait toggle and make sure to disable it. And that's it for the specific changes here. Hit OK to save the changes, and then hit the check mark at the bottom right to close the settings window. Now, going back to your shortcut of Dirt Showdown, hit the 3 dots on the right, tap on Settings, and then go to the Advanced tab to change the Box 64 preset to the Dirt Showdown one. And that's how we can create our own Box 64 preset and then apply it to a game. Nice and easy. So back to the actual performance of Dirt Showdown, which I do have set here to use the 960 by 544 resolution to get the most performance out of this game using the 24.3.0 turnip driver, the 1.10.3 DXVK wrapper, and changing the audio driver to pulse audio. After all of these changes, Dirt Showdown should launch, and it does run quite well here with Odin 2. In-game, I'm using medium settings, and so with the resolution setting, we do have a lot of room to adjust some of the settings here, with the frame rate mostly staying above 60 frames per second, which you just love to see here. And thanks to Winlator, we can enjoy Dirt Showdown on our Android devices, which essentially would not be possible natively outside of streaming. Doom 2016 makes a return here to the channel, and I personally love using this game for testing over in the PC world since it's a very optimized game that does well on a lot of hardware, and it certainly helps that it's a very fun first-person shooter. Obviously, this game doesn't have any kind of Android port, and so with Winlator, we have the next best option, which allows us to jump in and blast away the baddies. So for this game, there is a known issue with Winlator, and initially, if you just use our default container settings, the game will appear to start up just fine, but then it will lock up at the initial loading screen and never progress beyond that. So for this game, we will need to make some slight adjustments. First off, I recommend using the Vulkan EXE for Doom, which you can make a shortcut to by going into your container desktop. Now, I'm running the game at the 960 by 544 resolution for this footage to get the best performance possible. We will want to use the 24.1.0 turnip drivers and then switch the DX wrapper over to the VKD3D using version 2.13. For the audio drivers, switch on over to the Pulse Audio option. And then over in the Advanced tab, I recommend using the 0.3.1-2 Box 64 version. With all those changes made, you should be able to launch the game and then get past that initial loading screen and then get into game action, which, by the way, I have set to use medium settings, and it does quite well even using the VKD3D wrapper. Now, the interesting thing here is that after you started a new game and saved, you can exit out of the game and then switch on back over to the DXVK wrapper, and the game will work just fine getting past that initial screen. The cool thing is that the game performs quite well with either wrapper, so at least we do have options, but I will say that in general the DXVK wrapper performs slightly better, giving us a more consistent experience and higher frames per second. Doom 2016, like Bioshock Infinite, has a Switch port, but honestly the PC version with Winlator runs a whole lot better, and in general is the better way to go here. Now, it's no secret that I love doing these videos, and I've probably said this in the past, but part of the fun is not just exploring what's possible and showcasing that for everyone, but doing a video like this allows me to go on a journey through time, finding old gems that I haven't thought about in a long time. Driver San Francisco is one of those games that I absolutely adored back in the day, and like some of the other entries for this video, have kind of been lost to time partly because this game has been delisted, and so as the years go by, it falls further into obscurity. Driver San Francisco is another PS3 and Xbox 360 era game that released back in 2011 and is the last time that we would see the Driver franchise, which for whatever reason Ubisoft has decided to ignore for more than a decade now. And it's a shame because Driver San Francisco is a pretty solid entry in the franchise that has some very fun gameplay mechanics allowing you to shift out of your vehicle and teleport to another one in the city, and according to the developers it was actually inspired by Google Earth, and does make for something a bit unique in this genre. Driver is a game that just works really well with Winlator, and for this one, the only major change I needed to make was switching the audio driver to Pulse Audio. Other than that, we are set to a resolution of 1280 by 720, using the high graphics quality, and we are consistently staying above 60 frames per second, and at times getting almost to 120 frames per second, which is just phenomenal to see, and the game runs very smooth here on the Odin 2 portal. Now here's a game that I don't believe I've ever featured on the channel before, and I specifically wanted to showcase it since it's a bit different than some of the usuals we see here, like the Diablo franchise. Grim Dawn is an action RPG and was developed using the Titan Quest engine and actually builds on it by making improvements to it. If you're a fan of Titan Quest or games like Diablo, definitely check out Grim Dawn, which is an excellent hack and slash experience. Grim Dawn is readily available DRM free on GOG.com, which is the version that I am testing with here, and so that is another reason why I wanted to include it for this showcase, as well as it only being available on PC and Xbox One. Which means thanks to Winlator, we now have a very solid way to enjoy this game on our Android devices, including the Odin 2. Grim Dawn does have controller support, but you will need to toggle it on through the in-game settings, and it's a bit weird since the game will prompt you that parts of the UI isn't compatible, but just make sure to use your controller to move over to the X and close the window with the controller, and the game will work great with the controller and all the in-game actions can be handled properly. I have Grim Dawn here set to use a resolution of 1280 by 720, using low graphics, and the game mostly stays above 60 frames per second with these settings, and we are just using the default container settings for this game. Lost Planet Colonies Edition is another gem that comes to us from Capcom, and was the first entry in this new franchise that first launched early in the Xbox 360's life. I vividly remember playing this game on my Xbox 360 way back in 2007, and it was an impressive game visually at the time, and it still holds up quite well to this day. But Lost Planet had more going on for it than just visuals, with a cool premise and the mixture of on-foot gameplay, with the ability to use mech suits called Vital Suits that all blended together nicely. Even now as I play this game again, I always feel like I'm playing the video game version of Starship Troopers, just without the mech suits and all the snowy terrain. As the saying goes, the only good bug is a dead bug, and you will be killing plenty of those in Lost Planet, which makes for a good time, and despite it being one of the oldest games in this video, I think it's still well worth playing through, and thanks to the power of Winlator, we can enjoy it on Android. For Lost Planet, I recommend using the DirectX 9 EXE and then changing the audio driver to Pulse Audio. And the default containers should work great here with a resolution of 1280 by 720, and in-game I am set to use the default settings, which is a mixture of medium and high, and the game performs very well, staying well above 60 frames per second, and at many times above 100 frames per second. I will say that this game did initially crash on me when I opened it for the first time, but closing Winlator out and then launching it again seemed to resolve it, but it's possible it was just a fluke and one of those quirks with something like Winlator. Mad Max makes a return, and the last time I featured this game was in my last video dedicated to Winlator using the Retroid Pocket 5, which if you're not familiar with, uses the Snapdragon 865, and so here on the Odin 2 we have a lot more power to work with, and it definitely is obvious since this game performs a whole lot better here than it does on the Retroid Pocket Mini and 5. Mad Max's scope and scale makes it a pretty impressive showcase of what Winlator brings to the table, and this game comes to us from Avalanche Studios, the same studio behind Just Cause, and so the studio is certainly no stranger to the open world gameplay. Mad Max does require a specific setting adjusted, and so like we did for Dirt Showdown, you will want to make a duplicate of the Performance Box 64 preset, and then disable just one option, which is the Box 64 Fast Round setting, and then save it as its own preset, and then select the preset in your Mad Max shortcut under Advanced. Other than that, we can use our default container settings, and for this footage, I have Mad Max set to use the 1280 by 720 resolution, using normal settings, and if you want to get a sense of how much better it performs here, we are at many times double the frame rate over the Retroid Pocket 5, and also using a higher resolution. Now despite this, the game is very demanding, and so we are mostly staying above just 30 frames per second here, but I'll take it since this is an awesome game that otherwise would not be playable here without Winlator, and it also never received a Switch port. Best of all, it's readily available DRM free on GOG.com. Prey is our next game, and I believe one of the newest games that will be featured in this showcase. And just to be clear, I am talking about Prey 2017, and not the original game that released way early on for the Xbox 360, as well as on PC back in 2006. And doesn't really have a whole lot in common with that game outside of its name. Given that Prey released in 2017, this is an excellent technical showcase for Winlator as well as the capabilities of the Odin 2 lineup with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, since this is a PS4 and Xbox One era game that also never received a port to the Switch, which makes this even more interesting for us on Android. Prey is a first-person action-adventure game which is set in an alternate timeline and takes place on the Talos 1 space station. The game combines different gameplay elements, including an emphasis on exploration, storytelling, and providing the player with multiple ways to solve problems. The game has an awesome atmosphere, plenty of tense moments, and like many games on this list, I feel like it's a bit of an underrated gem. As I said before, this game is a technical marvel, and the fact that it looks this good and runs this well on the Odin 2 with Winlator is nothing short of amazing. For this game, I am set to use a resolution of 1280 by 720, using the low settings preset, and the only thing that needs to be changed here is the audio driver, which I recommend setting to pulse audio. I will say that you might get a warning at the start of the game, but if you just click on OK, it shouldn't be any problem. And performance for the most part is well above 60 frames per second, and at times stays higher than that. I do recommend installing this game to your C directory in Winlator since this game has some pretty long load times, and that will definitely help speed up those load times. And just like some of the other entries, Prey is readily available on GOG.com as a DRM-free option. Shadow of Mordor makes an appearance for the first time ever on the channel, and partly because there's a reason to feature here as another great showcase of what Winlator is capable of. Shadow of Mordor is an action-adventure game that's set in the Middle-earth universe and bridges the gap between The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings films. One of the coolest aspects of Shadow of Mordor is the Nemesis system, which generates unique orc enemies based on your performance in the game. Shadow of Mordor is a pretty impressive game with a massive scope and scale, and definitely pushes the Odin 2 hardware to the limits of what's possible using Winlator. For this game, we will need to create a custom Box 64 preset, which I covered during the Dirt Showdown portion. After you've made a duplicate of the performance preset, you will need to set the Box 64 Strong Mem to 3. For this game, I recommend using a 960 by 544 resolution for the best performance possible, and in-game for this footage I am set to use medium settings, but you can adjust some options here to squeeze just a little bit more, but in general performance will be about what you're seeing here, staying at or just slightly above 30 frames per second, which given the game is still quite impressive. Shadow of Mordor is available on GOG.com as a DRM-free option, and this is another great game that has no Switch port, and really without the PC version, we would have no other way to enjoy this on Android. The Saboteur is an older gem of a game from Pandemic Studios, and around the time this game came out, which was 2009, Pandemic was just absolutely cooking up all sorts of fantastic games like Full Spectrum Warrior, Star Wars Battlefront, Destroy All Humans, and Mercenaries to just name a few of the great experiences that they churned out. Sadly, the Saboteur was the last game developed by this amazing but short-lived studio. The Saboteur takes place in German-occupied France during World War II and is an open-world game that, as you expect, combines elements of driving, shooting, hand-to-hand combat, and of course, exploration. The visuals, voice acting, and just general design is top-notch, and the game, unfortunately, just didn't capture anyone's attention back then, and today is definitely one of those overlooked gems that, despite being a little rough around the edges, is still an interesting game to check out, especially here with Winlator. So for the Saboteur, after you've installed the game, you will want to go into the install folder and launch the Video Setup exe first to adjust the in-game settings, including the resolution, which I do have set at 1280 by 720 for this game, using low settings. For the game shortcut in Winlator, I recommend changing the audio driver to pulse audio, but other than that, you can leave the container settings to the default, and this game runs very well, staying mostly at 60 frames per second, and definitely fares a lot better here than on some other devices that I've tested this game out on. The Saboteur is readily available on GOG.com as a DRM-free option. Let's now go in a completely different direction with Saint Seiya Soldier's Soul, and an entry for manga and anime as well as fighting game fans. Saint Seiya is a pretty interesting entry which first began life as a PlayStation 3 exclusive, and then the updated version, which is Soldier's Soul, that made its way to the PC and the PlayStation 4. This game is a fighting game that was developed by Dimps, and this studio has experience with tons of fighting games, including games like Dragon Ball Xenoverse, Soul Calibur 6, and Street Fighter V. The game is based on the Saint Seiya manga with over 50 characters from that universe. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's a fun entry that is only available on PS3, PS4, and PC, and has never received a Nintendo Switch port. The game is also an excellent performer with Winlator using just the default container settings at a resolution of 1280 by 720, and gameplay stays locked to 60 frames per second without any issues. Unfortunately, like so many other games here, this has been delisted from PC storefronts, so you will want to hit up some of your favorite abandonware sites to grab the files for this game if you don't already own it on Steam. Shadow Warrior, and specifically the rebooted 2013 version, is a fun, over-the-top first-person shooter with swordplay thanks to the main character's signature weapon, the katana. I've always enjoyed this rebooted version of Shadow Warrior, which has great gameplay as well as visuals that still look great to this day, and the studio Flying Wild Hog is definitely best known today for their work with this franchise, which went on to have 2 additional sequels. I was originally going to feature this game with the Retro Pocket Mini, but performance wasn't quite where I wanted it, and so I saved it for more powerful hardware, which for the Odin 2 and its Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is certainly a nice jump up in performance. Despite this, the game is still pretty demanding since it was originally released for PC and then received ports to the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, if that gives you an indication of what we're working with here. For this footage, I am set to use a resolution of 1280 by 720 using medium settings, so you do have some room to adjust based on your own preferences. I do recommend using the DirectX 11 version for this game, and other than that, we are good to go with the default container settings. Best of all, this game, as well as its 2 sequels, are all readily available on GOG.com as a DRM-free option. Sleeping Dogs is another game that I featured in my last Winlator video for the Retro Pocket 5, and I don't think it's much of a surprise that I'm featuring it again for this showcase, as it's an excellent game that is well worth playing through, and as I've said before, I actually enjoy this game more than some of the GTA entries. Sleeping Dogs was a surprise performer on the Snapdragon 865, and naturally with the increased power of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, we are able to get better performance with the game, enjoying a bump up in resolution from 960 by 544 to 1280 by 720, as well as turning these settings up to the medium preset, all the while enjoying better frame rates overall as well. This game just looks gorgeous, and the visuals hold up really well with these settings, and best of all, it just works with the default container settings, as well as being a readily available game on GOG.com. Now I'm really excited about our next 2 games, since I absolutely love Platinum Games, and pretty much all of their games are some of my personal favorites. But Platinum has a lot of titles under their belt, and some have come and gone, being lost to time. Now take Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and combine it with the hack and slash gameplay that Platinum is best known for, and you get Mutants in Manhattan, which for Platinum was a one-off game that was published by Activision, and it was actually the last Nickelodeon game that was published by them. It gets a bit more interesting though, since this game is another one of those unfortunate games that have been delisted, but probably the most surprising is that it only happened less than 8 months after its release. Thankfully, the internet exists, and you can find this game on lots of abandonware sites, but in terms of Platinum Games, this is in many ways a forgotten gem that while it isn't groundbreaking, it's still a lot of fun, especially if you're a Turtles fan like me. Mutants in Manhattan is a game that runs incredibly well with Winlator at a resolution of 1280 by 720 using the high settings. The game is locked to 30 frames per second, which is how it was designed, and I didn't need to tweak any of the default container settings for this game. And Activision unsurprisingly had the rights to other licensed properties during this period, including Transformers, which meant we got the most unlikely marriage between the Transformers franchise and the action style that Platinum Games is best known for, with Transformers Devastation. Now to be fair, Devastation came out before Mutants in Manhattan, and honestly it is the better game of the 2. I'd go as far as saying that Devastation is one of the best Transformers games out there, and for any fan it comes highly recommended. Similar to Mutants in Manhattan, this game is unfortunately delisted because Activision no longer has the rights to the Transformers franchise, and so this is another game that is lost to time. It's a shame because this is an awesome game with fun gameplay, visual style, and all of our favorite Transformers characters, complete with excellent voice acting, and really is incredibly faithful to the source material. And just like Mutants in Manhattan is another excellent performer with Winlator, and it just put a huge smile on my face when I started this game up with Winlator and was able to play it here, which actually happened during CES at the Airbnb with my fellow YouTube friends like Stubbs, Zoo, Mikhailov, and Russ, who witnessed some of that excitement. For Devastation, I am set to use a resolution of 1280 by 720 with medium settings and a nice and locked 60 frames per second. This game is definitely well worth tracking down and should be easily found at the usual abandonware sites. And amazingly, we've got some more Transformers love to spread around here with Transformers War for Cybertron, which was another Activision published game, but was developed by High Moon Studios, and they really did the franchise justice, and to this day, many reference this as one of the better games in the Transformers franchise, with an excellent sequel, Fall of Cybertron, that was developed by the same studio. War for Cybertron is a third-person shooter that takes place on Cybertron, the home planet of the Transformers, during the civil war between the Autobots and Decepticons, and in this game you get to play as either side with 2 separate campaigns to play through. The gameplay is nothing groundbreaking, but it's a lot of fun being able to play as the Transformers, especially being able to transform on the fly with its own set of mechanics, and all of this is backed by excellent voice acting that makes the Transformers universe come to life. For this game, you will definitely want to make sure that you have the NVIDIA PhysX software installed, since this game does check for this dependency, and it should be included with your game as an installer, so just run the PhysX exe in your container. I did tweak a few settings for my shortcut and changed the turnip driver to use version 24.1.0, as well as the DXVK wrapper to use 2.5.2, and over in the advanced section, I recommend using the 0.3.2 Box 64 version with the stability preset. In game, I am running at 1280 by 720 with medium settings, and this game is hard capped at 30 frames per second, but does manage to stay consistently at this frame rate, and it's another game that just put a smile on my face seeing it run here with Winlator. Unfortunately, this game has long since been delisted, but is a fairly easy one to find on the internet and unusual abandonware sites. Now, we're not quite done with the licensed properties. Warhammer 40k Space Marine is another third-person shooter mixed with hack-and-slash gameplay that, as you guessed, takes place in the Warhammer 40k universe. This game was developed by Relic Entertainment, a studio that I started paying close attention to way back in the early Xbox 360 days with an old and forgotten game called The Outfit. The studio since has been responsible for tons of great games across various genres, including Company of Heroes, Age of Empires, and of course various Warhammer games. I recently found my way back to Space Marine because it finally received a sequel last year, more than a decade after the original release, and was actually developed and published by a completely different studio. Now, the original Space Marine has remained one of my favorite games from the 7th generation that again showcases one of the best aspects of Winlator, which is being able to revisit a lot of these games with our Android devices. For Warhammer, make sure to create a shortcut from the GOG installation folder that points to the Space Marine exe file. For this game, I am set to use a resolution of 1280 by 720 with low settings, and the only change I needed to make for the shortcut was switching the audio driver to Pulse Audio with no other changes to the shortcut settings. If the game gives you some issues, switch the wrapper to Wine D3D to set your settings in-game, and then switch back to DXVK. Otherwise, this game does very well with the Odin 2 and stays close to or locked to the 60 frames per second target. The game is also readily available on GOG, which makes me very happy to see. We're getting very close to the end here, and let's talk a little bit about Wolfenstein, specifically the modern takes on the franchise, and I thought it would be fun to feature one of these games, and in particular, the ones that did not receive a port to the Nintendo Switch. Wolfenstein: The Old Blood comes to us from Machine Games, and was the follow-up to their first game as a studio, Wolfenstein: The New Order, and since then have pretty much just developed lots of Wolfenstein games, but more recently the new Indiana Jones game. Interestingly, Machine Games was formed by former employees of Starbreeze Studios, who was responsible for older gems like The Chronicles of Riddick and The Darkness. Now, Wolfenstein: The Old Blood acts as a prequel to The New Order, and is set in an alternate history 1946, and like all of the entries, follows BJ Blazkowicz to take down the Nazis. I love these games, and they're just fun first-person shooter games to play through. The Old Blood was only released for the Xbox One, PS4, and PC, and so it's definitely a bit of a more demanding game here for the Odin 2, and pushes what we can do here with Winlator. For this footage, I do have the game set to use 1280 by 720 with low settings, and you can see that it is hovering above 30 frames per second, which is definitely playable, but unfortunately this game does not like any lower resolutions, like 960 by 544, which would definitely help performance, since I did test it at 800 by 600, and the game managed to stay up at 60 frames per second with that. The game does work right out of the box with the default container settings, and is readily available on GOG as a DRM-free option, and is actually on sale currently while I was putting together this video for just $4.99, which is definitely well worth it. And I can't think of any better way to close out this video than with a title like The Witcher 3, which I briefly showed off running in my Odin 2 Portal preview video, but I think it is well deserving of being highlighted here again as a game that does pretty well with Winlator. I don't think The Witcher 3 needs much of an introduction considering the popularity of the game even to this day, but for those not familiar, The Witcher 3 is developed by CD Projekt Red, most recently responsible for Cyberpunk, and follows the Witcher novels with Geralt of Rivia returning as the main character. As the title suggests, it is the third entry in the video game series, and probably one of the highest rated games for this showcase, and easily one of the finest games ever made. Now, The Witcher 3 does have a Switch port available, but in general, even though this is still a pretty demanding game for Winlator and the Odin 2, I find the experience here to be much better with Winlator and the PC version. For this footage and in general, I recommend going with a 960 by 544 resolution for the best performance possible, and changing the audio drivers to Pulse Audio, which will still have some issues with the audio, but not as frequently. And in-game I am set to use low settings, which still looks pretty solid here on the Odin 2 portal, and mostly maintains higher than 30 frames per second, depending on the scene. Other than that, we don't need to make any other changes to the shortcut settings. I do recommend installing this game to your Winlator C drive just to help with load times and performance in general, but it does need a moment to start up, so don't get discouraged at first if it appears nothing is happening. And of course, unsurprisingly, this game is readily available on GOG.com as a DRM-free option. And we have finally reached the end of this doozy of a video, and I really do hope that this helps those that might be curious or on the edge about trying out Winlator with their Odin 2 devices. There's no doubt about it that Winlator really has come a long way in a very short amount of time, and the doors that are now opened and possible thanks to the active development of Winlator and all of its forks. I know that this will not be the last time that we talk about Winlator on the channel, and if there's something that you'd like to see here, don't be shy and share down below in the comments section. Until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.